Nobody in Washington saw it coming. Not the strategists, not the press corps, not the career diplomats who had spent decades managing the delicate architecture of American foreign relationships. Because what happened between the President of the United States and the first American Pope in the history of the Catholic Church was not supposed to be possible. A sitting American president threatening the Vatican. An American Pope refusing to flinch. A private ultimatum delivered in the middle of the night. And a response the next morning that left the entire world standing completely still. This is the story of a confrontation that broke every rule of how power is supposed to work. Of a man in a white cassock who looked at the most powerful political office on earth and said, plainly, without theater, without retreat, no. Of the private moments that nobody televised. Of what was said behind closed doors that changed what happened in front of the cameras. And of the choice, made quietly, in the hours before dawn that ended up reshaping the lives of tens of thousands of people who never knew either man's name. If you think you have seen political courage before, stay with me. Because what you are about to hear is something different. This is the story they expected to bury. It refused to stay buried. The morning of November 15th arrived over New York with the particular grey weight of a city that knows something significant is about to happen inside its borders. The towers along the east side were misted at their peaks. The Hudson was the colour of pewter. And inside the General Assembly building of the United Nations, the organised machinery of global diplomacy was running at full pressure in preparation for the opening session of the Global Climate Action Summit. Delegates from nearly 200 nations had filed in. Translation headsets were distributed. Camera positions had been argued over since the previous evening. The Secretary-General's team had reviewed the running order 3 times. Everything was proceeding with the careful choreography that high-stakes international events require, precisely because so many things can go wrong when that choreography breaks down. What nobody had written into the running order was what was about to happen from the 4th speaker of the morning. Pope Leo XIV had been given his slot as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy toward the Holy See, whose observer status at the United Nations was a long-standing arrangement. His speech was expected to address environmental stewardship, the theological responsibility of care for creation, perhaps a gentle appeal for renewed multilateral commitment. The kind of address that lands warmly, generates respectful applause, and disturbs nothing. That was not the speech he had prepared. In his suite at the New York Palace Hotel 3 floors above Fifth Avenue, Leo XIV sat by the window in the early hours and read through his text one final time. His secretary, Monsignor Ariel Fortunato, stood near the desk turning the pages of his own annotated copy with the particular tension of a man who has read something several times and cannot decide whether to admire it or fear it. "Holy Father," Fortunato finally said, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone who has learned how to raise objections without provoking defensiveness. The section beginning on page 4, the direct references to the deportation program. "You understand that the President will be seated in the 3rd row." Leo looked out the window at the towers disappearing into cloud. He had grown up in this city. He had worked in its poorest parishes as a young priest. He knew what those towers contained and what they obscured. He knew what happened to people in the neighborhoods the towers did not reach. "Ariel," he said, and his voice was quiet in the way that quiet voices are sometimes louder than raised ones. 2.3 million people have been removed from this country in the past 8 months. Families split at border crossings. Children processed through facilities without their parents. Mothers deported to countries their children have never seen. He paused. "You are asking me to stand at a microphone in front of the assembled governments of the world and find a way to say nothing about that." Fortunato looked at the floor. "I am asking whether the cost of speaking directly is one the Church can absorb." Leo turned from the window. "The cost of not speaking is one I cannot absorb. Those are 2 different calculations, and only one of them is mine to make." When he walked into the General Assembly Hall at 10 in the morning, the atmosphere shifted in the way it does when a figure enters a room who carries something beyond personal authority. Leo XIV had the bearing of a man who had spent 50 years in service to something larger than himself, and had arrived, through that service, at a kind of stillness that power does not produce and cannot replicate. He began the way no one expected him to end. His opening passages were measured, even tender. The earth as a gift, creation as a responsibility. The language of Genesis applied to the emergency of climate science with the precision of someone who understood both deeply. Delegates settled into the rhythm of it. Cameras panned the room. It was good. It was expected. And then it changed. "There is another crisis," he said, and the word "another" landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. A crisis that has no clean separation from the one we are gathered to address. Because the same logic that allows a society to treat the natural world as a resource to be consumed without consequence is the logic that allows a society to treat human beings as a problem to be eliminated without apology. The hall became a different kind of quiet. I am speaking about what has been done in the name of national security and economic protection to millions of human beings whose only crime was desperation. I am speaking about families separated at borders, about children processed in holding facilities without their parents present, about mass removals executed with the efficiency of logistics and the indifference of bureaucracy, about policies that have been defended by men who hold Bibles at public events and quote scripture at campaign rallies while implementing programs that contradict every principle those texts contain. In the third row, President Donald Trump had gone very still, the kind of stillness that is not calm. Leo continued. Leadership that invokes faith as a political credential while constructing policy around its opposite is not leadership of faith. It is theater dressed in the costume of conviction. And I have a responsibility, not a political one, but a pastoral one, to call that theater by its name. He paused, and in the pause the entire room held its breath. Because Matthew's Gospel does not say, "I was a stranger and you assessed my documentation." It says, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." That is not poetry. That is instruction. The applause that followed was prolonged and loud, the standing kind. The kind that delegates do not give to speeches that merely confirm what they already believed. Trump and his team remained seated. Their faces were composed in the specific way that faces compose themselves when composure is an act of will. The response came faster than anyone had anticipated. Before the afternoon sessions had concluded, Fortunato's phone was generating alerts in his breast pocket with the urgency of something alive. He stepped into the corridor and looked at his screen and had to read the post twice before he accepted that he had read it correctly. Trump had posted publicly, directly in the language he reserved for adversaries he intended to damage. "The Vatican receives substantial American generosity," the post read. "A foreign religious leader who uses the United Nations as a platform to insult American sovereignty and attack American policy should not expect that generosity to continue indefinitely. Nobody tells the United States what to do. Not in a white robe, not in a white dress. America first." Fortunato found the Pope in preparation for the afternoon reception and handed him the phone without speaking. Leo read it once. Then again. Something moved across his face, something composed of equal parts sorrow and a particular kind of clarity that sorrow sometimes produces. "Someone in a white dress," he repeated softly. He handed the phone back. "We will not answer this on the platform he chose. That would be accepting his terms for the argument." But the president was not finished. At 3 p.m, standing in front of cameras in his hotel lobby with the practiced ease of someone who has always understood that cameras are his natural habitat, Trump expanded his public attack with methodical precision. He questioned Leo's representativeness, suggesting that the millions of American Catholics who had supported Trump's election were better served by their president than by their pope. He questioned the church's standing to comment on American policy. He raised the prospect of legal review of tax-exempt status for Catholic organizations. He dismissed Leo by name with deliberate casualness, the kind of contemptuous familiarity deployed to reduce rather than engage. That evening, in the Vatican suite, Leo watched the broadcast with Fortunato and Cardinal Benedetti, who had flown in from Washington that afternoon with the expression of a man who has been carrying bad news for several hours and has not yet found the right moment to deliver it. The cardinal set down his portfolio carefully. "Holy Father," he said, "there is a private communication." From the White House. It arrived through the embassy 2 hours ago, He hesitated. It is significantly more aggressive than anything said publicly. He produced a printed document. Leo read it without expression, without movement, without any of the visible responses that people exhibit when they are reading something that frightens or angers them. He read it the way someone reads a text they have, in some sense, been waiting for. The message was direct to the point of being deliberately insulting. It described the UN speech as an act of hostility toward the United States. It listed specific retaliatory measures under consideration: executive action reviewing diplomatic recognition of the Vatican, Treasury Department review of Catholic organizational tax exemptions, suspension of all U.S. humanitarian funding administered through Catholic Church networks globally. It set a deadline of 24 hours for a public retraction and apology. It described these not as threats but as facts. Leo set the document down. He looked out the window at New York at night, the city burning quietly beneath its own reflection. "Fortunato," he said finally, "schedule a press conference for 9 tomorrow morning." Fortunato stared at him. "You are going to apologize. I am going to respond. Holy Father, if you refuse his demands, he will execute every one of those measures. The humanitarian programs alone serve millions of people in countries where they have no other options. The poor will pay for this." Leo turned from the window. He looked at Fortunato with an expression that was not cold and was not indifferent, but was absolutely resolved in the way that certainty resolves a face. "And if I apologize for telling the truth to preserve the programs that exist to serve the truth, Ariel, then what exactly are we preserving?" He moved to the small prayer room adjoining the suite and did not emerge until after midnight. The conference room of the New York Palace Hotel was not designed for the kind of moment it hosted at 9 the next morning. It was designed for product launches and corporate presentations, but the 200 journalists packed into it, and the hundreds of millions of people who would watch on screens around the world, converted it, temporarily, into one of the more consequential rooms the year produced. Leo XIV entered without ceremony, without the procedural gravity of formal papal appearances. He wore his white cassock. He walked to the table at the front of the room, the simple wooden table that his team had requested specifically. No podium, no elevated platform, no visual architecture of authority. He sat down. He looked at the room. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you for coming on short notice." 100 cameras adjusted their focus simultaneously. "I want to begin," he said, "not with a statement, but with a story. Because policies are abstractions, and abstractions are easy to argue about. People are harder to argue away." He told them about a family he had met during a winter night 30 years earlier, when he was a young priest working at a shelter on the south side of Chicago. A father, a mother, 3 children. They had crossed the border without documentation, twice, because the alternative had been watching their youngest daughter starve in a country where the government was actively hunting her father. The father, the night they arrived at the shelter, had looked at the young priest and asked him a question that had not left him in 3 decades. He asked, "If your child was dying, what law would you not break to save her?" Leo looked at the room. That question is not a justification for illegal entry. It is a description of what desperation actually is. And the answer, for any parent in that situation, is that there is no law they would not break. That is what I was speaking about at the United Nations yesterday. Not policy abstractions, that family. He reached across the table and lifted a piece of paper. The room recognized it before he named it. The White House letter, printed and placed there before anyone arrived. "I received this last night," he said. He read the key sections aloud, his voice even, his pace measured, giving the words space to demonstrate what they were. Then he set the paper down. "My response is this: I will not apologize. I will not retract a word of what I said at the United Nations. And I want to be precise about the reason." The room was entirely still. "President Trump," he said, "you have threatened to suspend funding for programs that feed children in countries where children are starving. You have threatened the financial structures that allow the church to operate clinics in communities where there is no other medical care. You have done this because I said that separating children from their parents is morally wrong. I want to be clear about what that sequence of events means. It means you are prepared to use the suffering of the vulnerable as a weapon against someone who objected to the suffering of the vulnerable. The logic of that position does not need my commentary. It comments on itself. A sound moved through the room that was not quite a gasp and not quite applause, something between the two, the involuntary sound of people processing something they were not prepared to hear, said out loud. He continued, "You and I are both Americans. I grew up in this country. I understand what it was built on, what it was built by. It was built by people who arrived without papers, without invitation, without any guarantee of welcome, including your family, Mr. President, including the families of most people in this room. The question the Statue of Liberty asks is not whether the tired and the poor have the correct documentation. It asks whether we still mean what we said we meant when we put those words on a monument and called it an identity." He paused. "You may proceed with every action you described in your letter. That is your legal authority, and I would not pretend otherwise. But the children who go hungry when those programs close will not go hungry because of my speech. They will go hungry because of your response to it. The world will know the difference." He stood. "One final thing. Somewhere around 2,000 years ago, a political authority with considerably more military power than the current American administration attempted to silence a message it found inconvenient. It had every practical instrument of enforcement at its disposal. The message survived. That is not a threat. It is simply the most relevant historical data available on this particular question." He picked up the letter from Trump. "I will keep this," he said, "not as a souvenir, as a reminder of what courage costs and why the cost is worth paying. May God give wisdom to everyone in this room and to everyone watching, including, especially, the President of the United States." He walked out. The 48 hours that followed operated at a pace that the architecture of normal news cycles was not designed to contain. The speech aired in full on every major network. Clips spread across every platform. In parishes across America, priests who had never addressed immigration policy from the pulpit found their congregations asking them to respond. In homes where both a crucifix and an American flag hung on the wall, people sat with the particular discomfort of those being asked to hold two loyalties that had, without warning, stopped pointing in the same direction. Inside the White House, the situation was not going according to the plan that had seemed so straightforward 24 hours earlier. The executive orders were drafted, sitting on the Resolute desk waiting for a signature. 3 advisors had told the president that signing them would generate the kind of sustained negative coverage that had no ceiling. One senior communications official had quietly submitted a resignation letter that she then declined to send, deciding instead to wait and see. Trump was in the residence when Melania found him. He was watching a loop of the press conference coverage with the volume loud enough that staff in the adjacent hallway could hear every word the Pope had said. Melania entered, nodded to the single aide in the room, and waited until they were alone. She sat across from him, not beside him. The specific seating choice of someone who needs to be seen as well as heard. "Donald," she said, "what you are about to sign." She paused. "I need you to think about who it punishes." He started to answer and she raised her hand with the gentle firmness she rarely deployed, but which, when deployed, functioned differently than any argument. "You know where I came from," she said. "You know the country I left and why people leave countries. You know my family's story and what it cost." She held his gaze. "The families this man is defending are not your enemies. They are people who want what every person who ever came to this country wanted. What I wanted. What your grandfather wanted when he arrived from Germany with nothing." She stopped. "And you are about to use their hunger as a weapon, because a priest embarrassed you." Trump looked away from her. He looked at the television. He looked at the window. He did not speak for a long time. Finally he said, very quietly, "He made me look weak in front of everyone." Melania answered without hesitation. "Then show them what strength actually looks like." The next morning, Trump did not sign the executive orders. What he did instead surprised everyone who had spent 2 days building models of what he would do. He posted a single message inviting Pope Leo XIV to the White House for a private meeting. No cameras, no prepared statements, 2 Americans talking directly. The Vatican's response accepted the invitation with one condition: that the meeting be followed by a joint press availability where both men answered questions directly. Transparency, the statement noted, is not something that can be applied selectively. They met on a Wednesday morning in November, in the Oval Office, with the staff cleared out and the doors closed. Two men who had spent the previous week publicly defining each other and who now sat across the most famous desk in American politics, trying to locate the human being on the other side. Trump told the Pope something he had not told his advisors or his press team or anyone whose job was to manage the image of what he said. He told him that his greatest fear was irrelevance, that the thing he wanted most from the presidency was something that would last, a legacy that people would still be talking about when he was gone. Leo looked at him for a moment before responding. Then he said, simply, "The legacies that last are not built from walls. They are built from the moments when powerful people chose to be merciful when they did not have to be." Trump was quiet for a long time. They did not leave that room as friends. Exactly. But they left it as something the week before had not permitted them to be. Two flawed men who had located, somewhere in the friction of an improbable conversation, the recognition that the person across from them was capable of something more than the worst version of themselves. When they stepped outside together, the world watching on every available screen saw something it had not expected to see. Not reconciliation, not capitulation, not performance. Just two people who had chosen, in private, to find the harder path. 3 weeks later, Trump signed an executive order suspending deportations of families with children under 12. The announcement was straightforward, unadorned by the usual rhetorical scaffolding. He said only that America could be both strong and decent, and that in his judgment those two things had been allowed to drift too far apart. At reunification centers across Texas and Arizona, families who had been separated for months were brought back together. The footage of those reunions moved across the internet without political framing, without commentary, without the usual partisan architecture that structures how Americans process news. It moved because it was simply human. On Christmas Eve, in the Basilica of St. Peter's, Leo Civ was mid-homily when he reached into his cassock and produced his phone. He read to the congregation a message he had received that afternoon. It said that 42 families were spending Christmas together who would otherwise have spent it apart. It said that the president still disagreed with the Pope on most things, and probably always would. It said, simply, "You were right that we can do better. Merry Christmas." The congregation responded with the kind of silence that is louder than applause. In Washington, the president watched the broadcast with the First Lady beside him. When the message was read aloud, Melania reached over and took his hand. He did not say anything. He watched the screen. And in the particular quality of that silence, something that had been closed for a very long time remained, quietly, open. This is not a story about a pope defeating a president. It is not a story about politics finding its conscience or power discovering its limits. It is a story about what happens when someone with nothing to gain from courage chooses it anyway. About what that choice costs. About what it opens. About the way truth, spoken without a weapon but without a retreat, moves through the world at a speed that no counter-strategy can match. History will argue about the policies. It will debate the precedents. It will analyze the diplomatic implications for years. But the thing it will keep returning to, the thing that does not reduce to analysis, is the image of a man in a white cassock sitting down at a plain wooden table with no notes, no script, no armor, except the conviction that the truth does not require protection, only a voice willing to carry it. He found that voice. The rest, as they say, followed.